So our next presenter is Josh Aleri from the Faculty of Veterinary and Agricultural Science in the University of Melbourne. And the title of his presentation is Periparturient Immunosuppression and Strategies to Improve Dairy Cow Health During the Periparturient Period.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present this paper. And my presentation today will be on the causes of periparturient, and also I'll be looking at some control strategies that many research groups are advancing. Straight to the introduction, as we've all had today. What is the periparturient period? Simply, this is 2 to 3 weeks before calving, before and after calving, and it's quite an important time period, both for the dairy farmer and the health of the dairy cattle. And the reasons being it's quite labor intensive, and also majority of the health problems do occur at this time. And taking you back to most of the presentations that we've had today, what has led to this high incidence of these health problems? Looking at the risk factors that most presenters have presented today, and also of very great importance is a mention on a genetic component. And also we've observed that there's an immunosuppression component that is leading to this high incidence. Just taking you back from the previous presentation, who talked about is subclinical mastitis, hypocalcemia really true? And I would like to tell him that we have some of the answers to that. It's immunosuppression phenomena, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, he'll be able to know which type of immunosuppression phenomena. So the main objective for this study were to look at the causes of immunosuppression, and also some of the review strategies that many research groups are looking at. So methodology, this was a retrospective study or a systematic review that was performed from using literature or scientific reports from 1980 to 2015. And the methodology is as shown above. And the main important thing within this methodology or selection of the scientific reports is that we selected only peer-reviewed scientific reports and a few of some conference proceedings that were linked to some scientific papers. So, quick overview of our study. If we ask ourselves, what is immunosuppression? Simply, this is just a reduced ability for the immune system to mount an effective immune response. And we can observe immunosuppression in 2 ways. Externally, by the occurrence of most of these infectious diseases occurring at the periparturient period, and also at the subclinical level where we can see, which is mainly due to impaired leukocytic activity. And from our review, we were able to break down immunosuppression into 2 arms, transient immunosuppression and prolonged immunosuppression. So subclinical hypocalcemia is truly transient immunosuppression. So, and transient immunosuppression, prolonged immunosuppression is linked to transient immunosuppression. So with our review, we were able to come across a lot of causes that are causing immunosuppression, and these were broken down into the various categories, mainly as the act of parturition by itself, impaired leukocytic activity, the 2 physiological activities of colostrogenesis and lactogenesis, and also under prolonged immunosuppression, we looked at, or we found out that the genetics or reduced resilience within the cows, and also 2 main important nutritional factors, negative energy balance, hypocalcemia, and also managemental stresses, including the environment. So this is just a quick slide to show you about the immune system, because that will form part of my discussion. The immune system has 2 arms, the innate, then the adaptive, which we can measure, and we can measure 2 components, cell-mediated and antibody, which forms overall immune response. And also, a really important thing is if you can't measure some of these factors, you can't really improve. So we are lucky to be able to measure immune response. So looking at transient immunosuppression, this is quite complex. This is a quite complex process, but the main trigger would be a lot of cortisol being produced at this stage. And also, this leads to inhibition of the immune system by prolonging anti-inflammatory factors and also inhibiting pro-inflammatory factors, and selectively inhibiting one arm of the immune system. And what we can see, you get impaired leukocytic activity or downregulation of leukocytic receptors. And also the act of colostrogenesis by itself is quite involving because there's a lot of transfer of immunoglobulins from the dam to support the colostrum. So with the prolonged immunosuppression, some of the factors that lead to increased immunosuppression still fall under reduced resilience within the genetic breeds, which have been selected mainly for production with less emphasis on survival and longevity traits. So the more important thing to ask ourselves, what are the survival or longevity traits? And most of them have been discussed today. And it's really important because we can measure most of them, so we can improve most of them. So going into the control strategies, two main control strategies, short-term and long-term. And the short-term control strategies mainly look into nutritional or addressing nutritional demands, such as the negative energy balance, hypocalcemia, and also on farm management. And I will not dwell on this a lot because it's been discussed today as part of the keynote. And looking into long-term immunosuppression, so there is a genetic component. So while addressing long-term immunosuppression, the genetic component has to be really addressed. And we are lucky to be able to measure immune competence, and we're using immune competence as a survival trait to be able to address a long-term strategy of improving transition cow. So this is just a quick snapshot on the integrated feeding management that most research groups are looking at. And also to remember that there are different strategies of nutritional management at the periparturient period, so that some countries don't really have an ideal, but this is one way of improving that. So with the long-term strategy that we are looking at is called it's immune competence testing, which is a holistic health approach that simply involves identification and selection of animals based on their immune response, the two arms. And it's a really important or favorable technique because we can incorporate other production or survival traits or longevity traits. So how do we measure immune response? Currently, there are only two protocols, one being performed in Canada and one in Australia. So the Canadian protocol has gone commercial, but they do use non-conventional antigens. But in Australia, we're using a conventional antigen, 7-in-1, to be able to measure immune response. So simply, we measure the two arms, antibody-mediated immune response and cell-mediated immune response. And thereafter have these two measures and link them together to have an overall immune response. So studies within the intensive Canadian production system has shown a lot of correlation between animals with high immune response with reduced disease incidences at the transitional stage. And this is Professor Bonnie Mallard's group at Guelph. And we, in the pasture-based system in Australia, we've been able to develop a protocol which is repeatable, and we are in the stage of looking at the associations between immune competence and other survival or longevity traits, such as stress, growth rates, and reduced disease incidences as well. So apart from reduced disease incidences, selecting animals using immune competence is beneficial because other we've seen correlations with other production traits, and also there is a good association with vaccine response, as well as stress coping abilities. So in conclusion to my presentation, immune suppression is a phenomenon that occurs at the periparturient period, and we've been able to break it down into two groups or two arms, transient and prolonged. And transient, we can also call it normal immunosuppression, because it's such a stressful time period where most cows do go through this episode. But however, depending on the genetic merit of the animal or the resilience, that's when you'll be able to see prolonged immunosuppression. So subclinical, something like hypocalcemia or subclinical hypocalcemia, is a form of transient immunosuppression, you can say that. And prolonged immunosuppression, which manifests with the occurrence of some of these metabolic diseases, is due to the reduced resilience and issues of negative energy balance, hypocalcemia, and also managemental stresses, including the environment. So two control strategies: short-term addressing nutritional needs, and one long-term strategy that addresses survival and longevity is selecting animals based on immune competence. With that, thank you, and I would invite some questions here.
So an excellent presentation on a really, really important topic of immunosuppression, one that's being reinforced this morning again now in this session here. So Josh, if you want to stay there, if there's any questions for Josh, we won't let him off that soft. You might raise your hands there, and we'll get a microphone to you.
I thought the time was over.
Yeah. Great. So to start with, I might just ask you, Josh, I suppose with all sort of phenotypic sort of expressions and everything, it's a sort of a combination of the environment, which would be, of course, your transition cow management and all that, as well as the genotype. And what degree of heritability do you think there is in the immune system and the ability to, I suppose, be more resistant to disease?
Thank you for that question. We've been able to see that immune competence has fair to high heritability between 0.4 to 0.6. But the important thing to consider is that immune competence has two arms, so the antibody and the cell-mediated. So when we're selecting, we're ideally selecting for an overall immune competence, which has fairly to moderate heritability.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Any further questions for Josh? Great. So thanks very much. Give a round of applause again to Josh. No, so just